Uh, Good morning. The topic might be bit misleading. The session is on competition and transparency, competition and consumer choice. But what I'm going to talk about consumer voice. So, choice choice by choice, I mean retail competition, and it's not so straightforward. I mean, we may have a little bit of competition in Mumbai, or we can scale it up to Delhi or bigger cities, but providing real choice to consumers in remote areas, it's not going to be easy. But that's the ultimate goal. Like 3 decades back, what Professor Little Child told, I completely agree with that. Competition is going to be the ultimate goal, but until that, we need to regulate effectively so that we have a better competition when we get into that. And keeping in mind of that, what I suggest is before we bring in retail competition, we need to introduce consumer voice in the process. Yeah. Um the classic book by Professor Hirschman talks about 3 choices: exit, voice, loyalty. When when there's poor quality of service or there's lesser benefit to the consumer have 2 choices. Either they exit, go for an alternative supplier, or they raise their voice through complaints, through grievances, or proposal for change. Uh, in a typical competitive economy, there is scope for exit. You can choose an alternative supplier, like what happens in industry in India. We're not happy with one service provider, we shift to another one. But in case of a system where there is no choice, the only option consumer is left with is voice. And the consumer voice can take 3 forms. One is voice directly communicated to the supplier through in complaint or in regular interaction, or second level they can raise their voice indirectly through consumer protection agencies or the regulators who have power over the supplier. And in the third case, which could be extreme and which has happened occasionally in India, people get into agitation, protest, they burn, they attack the service providers, and sometimes it's more politicized as well. So what's the state of consumer voice in Indian electricity? Is there any voice? What are the platforms available to the consumers? Are consumers accessing those platforms? How effective they are? According to the Electricity Act 2003, there are 2 level of forums created where the consumers can raise their voice. And I would like to say that 2003 Act is not the first act which talks about consumer. Consumer interest has been, at least on paper, has been a cause in India since the very beginning with 1948 Act, which made provisions for local advisory committees with consumers, consumer consultation committees at local level. But in 2003 Act, it's kind of institutionalized with a couple of provisions. One that requires to establish consumer grievance redressal forum at each DISCOM level. And on top of that, there's the ombudsman at state level, where the consumers can bring in their grievances, and if they're not satisfied at CGRF level, they can move to ombudsman, and then it goes to the judiciary directly. But then there's another level in the regulatory commission level where the consumers are allowed to participate on all the policy matters, including the tariff issues, where they can represent their interest. And then the Act has made a provision for standards of performance for utilities, which has been taken as a measurement for performance, as a measurement of performance indicator. If the utilities do not perform by that standard, they are either penalized or um, they're penalized. And right now, we have been conducting a study looking into level of consumer awareness, engagement in the process, and their voice, how effective it is, in 5 states: Delhi, Haryana, Rajasthan, Karnataka, and Maharashtra. We are in the process of the study, and the final findings will come somewhere around end of the year. But I'll present some initial findings. Before that, let me talk about one study which was recently completed by Learning Asia of Colombo, and they tried to compare consumer satisfaction in electricity and telecom service in India, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. And interestingly, in terms of electricity, their finding was the service quality and is poorest in India, yet the consumer satisfaction level is very high. It's above 70%. I mean, I mean, usually people say that this is, I mean, 4 hours power cut in a day or frequent interruptions, this is what is way of life. I mean, they don't have any complaint with that. Consumers have issues, but they don't want to raise it. So in our survey, we are also finding similar find. People are quite okay with whatever the service quality is. So across the states, our finding says political economy of the states vary. So does the institutions and the processes. The institutions, particularly how it has been institutionalized, let's take up the case of Consumer Grievance Redressal Forum. The Act doesn't make specific just wants the states to have specific consumer grievance redressal forums at DISCOM level. But then the states have interpreted it differently. Some states have adopted something which used to exist earlier called settlement committee and just renamed them as CGRF. But some states have done very well. Some states have done, like Haryana, they have a mobile CGRF, which goes to every circle every month. I mean, that's what has been claimed so far. And in case of Karnataka, they are going for district level CGRF so that it's more accessible to the consumers. It varies. I mean, in Maharashtra, they have probably 14 CGRFs. I mean, 14 in MSEDCL area. So that's one level of issue. Then the processes in each institution again varies. I mean, how they interpret what kind of complaints, grievances can come to CGRF, again, the states interpret differently. So while typically any sort of grievance that has not been addressed by the utilities should come up to the Consumer Grievance Forum, but that doesn't happen. Usually the CGRF addresses the grievances which is in monetary in nature, which involves some money, typically billing cases, while the quality and standards of performance issues are not dealt so well. Then the third issue is that, okay, we have institutions now in place, but institutions also matter. Then leadership also matters. All these institutions under different leadership have performed differently. Some leaders have been more proactive. They have taken more proactive measures, have tried to interact with the consumer, but some have been not so open to the consumers. So ultimately, the end result is the consumer voice is very much fragmented. What happens is consumers have individual complaints. Some consumers come up to these forums and some step back, but all these forum complaints do not turn into a kind of common issue. The individual problems don't assimilate as a collective issue. So that's a major problem. So consequently, there's high level of distrust in the system, and particularly with the DISCOMs. And what Mr. Dal just pointed out, the CAG audit as demanded by the ex-Chief Minister of Delhi is a kind of reflection of the distrust. So then the other problem is all these issues coming up at a lower level, the CGRF level, that has not been taken over at a larger level. Particularly, all these complaints are neither monitored at the regulatory commission level, nor the utilities are questioned on that basis. So now it's time to amplify those consumers, fragmented consumer voice at upper level. In that regard, while we are working towards the retail competition in the sector, we need to focus on few things. I mean, the three precise things we need to get right so that we have a better system when we introduce retail competition in the sector. First, we need to get our institutions right. What's their role, what's their jurisdiction, we need to get that right. And one point here I would like to point out, while going to CGRF, visiting CGRFs and regulatory commissions, particularly at CGRF level, we found that in some cases, it's becoming a little more legalistic in the sense sometimes, just one minute, sometimes consumers are required to take advice of advocates and bring in, present a legal justification for their case. And even some CGRF members said that because the consumer has not asked this on their prayer, we are not going to consider this. So it has to be everything on pen and paper. So we need to get our institutions right and bring coherence in the process. Though we have everything in all the CGRFs in states, but we need to bring in coherence. And then ensure compliance with the regulations. Whatever regulation exists, we need to follow that. The second thing is improve awareness of consumers, and whatever fragmented voice, as I told earlier, is there, let's amplify that voice at larger level. Thirdly, and that's most important, we need to improve communication and engagement between the consumers and discoms. And why this matters, consumer participation and voice matters, it will help us to reflect on consumer perspective in the new system we are planning and bridge the knowledge barrier that exists between, when we move into retail competition, we need to, there will be several technical issues, like the tariff has to be bifurcated into several components that consumer needs to understand, and what they will be paying, what they can expect, and why that should happen. Then there would be better understanding and acceptance among the consumers for any rational decision taken. I'll stop here. Thank you.